We've got a great show today. We got Dan Simon talking about the money hackers, these people that have created so much innovation. We'll talk, I'm sure, about companies, like Lending Club, like Credit Karma, and lots more. We're going to talk innovation in your wallet on today's show. But first, we got some headlines. So let's get moving. Dan Simon is a writer, an entrepreneur, and financial communications expert. He's been part of the fintech revolution since its inception. He's advised some of the biggest brands in the space, including little-known companies like Morgan Stanley, Bloomberg, and a little firm called Goldman Sachs. Daniel's focus on finance and its future led him to become CEO and co-founder of Vested, which is an integrated communications firm where he and his team partner with top financial and fintech companies. His curiosity related to all things finance and his unique viewpoint as an insider in the financial industry have perfectly positioned him for today's interview. We're talking to the man who's been following it with a front row seat, this change in technology, the artful change in technology. Let's say hi to Dan Simon. And on my dad's shortwave, it's our new friend, Dan Simon. Dan, how are you, man?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
I want to start where you start in the book because I found this, I guess, juxtaposition between these two pictures that you paint to be a great starting place, Daniel. You talk about, you've got these big names in New York, people like Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, and they're all looking at their BlackBerries, right? Which at the time was the big thing that everybody had, because they're wondering, this is 8 days after the Bear Stearns blow up, and they're wondering if it's going to blow up everything. And at that time across the country, you talk about there's something going on that really is creating this incredible new revolution.
Yeah.
Tell me about that other thing.
It does feel a little bit like a pop quiz, Joe. You know, I put the book to bed a good 6 months ago. So
I'm going to see if I can make you sweat.
No, you're right. That at the heart of the conceit at the heart of the book is about the two coasts. For those of us like me who lived in New York, 2008, when you think about it, means one thing, and it means standing outside the Lehman Brothers building and watching the lights go off. And on the West Coast, 2008 probably is best remembered for the creation of the App Store or Facebook hitting 100 million users. Or maybe if you were super on the interwebs and super techie nerdy, there was this cypherpunk going on, and there was this creation of this white paper by this crazy sort of secret guy called Satoshi Nakamoto, and who came up with this new blockchain technology and Bitcoin. All of that was happening in 2008 too. And so, you have two very different narratives happening at the exact same moment, and that creates, in essence, the world that we live in today.
I want to talk a little bit about the iPhone, just because you do such a great job of talking about the early days there. I never realized, Daniel, that Steve Jobs initially didn't care about apps. He didn't want apps on that phone at all. Yeah. How did that come about?
Well, because the App Store was a necessity. They say necessity is the mother of invention. If you think about it, the App Store is very anti-Apple in many ways, right? Jobs was a perfectionist. If you've read, Walter Isaacson's biography of him or anything that Malcolm Gladwell has to say on him, he wanted everything to be a perfect box, software, hardware, everything. And so actually the App Store is the antithesis of that. If you think about maybe the worst Dell computer came with that bloatware, right? That's what he was trying to avoid. There's a reason why the iPhone tends not to get viruses. It didn't do some of the things that users wanted it to do. And so they were hacking it. I was one of those people, actually. I got I hacked my first iPhone to be able to do different things. Developers wanted in on it. And so that was a concession on Jobs' part. But it begins a progress of opening up. It begins a movement to kind of free it and let people in and let people build with that data. And the App Store was creating in 2008, became a thread of a narrative that exists today.
It's so interesting from that starting point. Then you have all of these people in this revolution. And I'd like to start where you do. Obviously, we don't have time to go over the whole book. And if people want it, Daniel, we'll talk about how they can get it themselves. But I would like to talk about maybe the first couple stories. So you got these two guys, Igrim, is it pronounced Akram, and Andrew, and everything changed because one of them forgot their wallet. Tell me their story.
Sure. It's Ikram and Andrew. They were working together on a music app, and one of them forgot their wallet when they went out to eat. And so the other one spotted him dinner, and then they needed a way to split that. And it's incredible to think that only 12 years ago, that was actually pretty hard. You had a couple of choices. You could cut someone a check, which seems very antiquated. You could walk to an ATM and you could take out money. And then if it wasn't an even denomination of dollars, you probably have to go somewhere and buy a pack of gum to split it. I mean, it's quite a lot of friction. And what we were just talking about in 2007, actually, and then 2008 with the App Store, there is this incredible computing power that just suddenly becomes available in everybody's pocket. And so they stop what they're doing on the music app and they pivot, which is a very West Coast thing to think about doing. They pivot to creating what we would know as a peer-to-peer payments platform, which everyone else calls Venmo.
How often did you find that to be the case as you were telling all these different stories, Daniel, that the founder was going one way and they noticed a problem that was seemingly unrelated, but then they went and grabbed that? Were they usually personal stories, or are they more stories about people that saw a gap in the marketplace?
Both. One of my favorite stories in the book along those same lines is Steve Street, who created Green Dot. Green Dot today is the largest bank serving the underbanked, people who aren't typically served by the traditional banking system. Steve had a previous career. This is very consistent, by the way. None of the people in my book look and sound like your grandparents' banker, because they're not. And Steve was working in the music industry. He was an A&R guy, and they were like, well, what is this music? It's not rock and roll, but it's not pop music. And he said, it's soft rock. And that stuck. So his first claim to fame was inventing soft rock.
And now, by the way, every grocery store I go into, I've got him to thank.
Yes, Steve Street. So he takes his payout from the music industry, and he has this great idea, which is credit cards for teenagers. Imagine the card. It's got stamped with like kids with beanie caps and skateboards on it. And he thinks this is going to be marvelous. Right. And it doesn't sell. And weeks and weeks go by and not a single card is sold. Eventually, the sales of the card starts picking up. And much to his chagrin at the time, it wasn't teenagers at all who wanted a cool brand of prepaid credit card. It was 50-year-old African-American men. It was 40-year-old Latino men. It was workers from the local building site. And so he starts watching this and he realizes he's created a product for an entire market. Kids could not care about this whatsoever. But who really does want a prepaid credit card are people who are being excluded from the traditional financial system. And so now they have an opportunity. They go into a 7-Eleven, they put $500 down, they get this credit card. That's a great example of an entrepreneur, and it's a marvelous story, but he never sold a single credit card to a teenager.
That's incredible. And I wonder, as I sit here and I listen to you, Daniel, banks could be right on top of this. There's the whole banking industry seems like they already have technology. They have technology departments. Why is it somebody with this very personal problem versus the banking institution, which already has, you'd think would be on top of this?
Are you asking why did banks not spot these opportunities?
Exactly.
There's several answers to that. To really understand it, you have to go back to 2008. In 2008, the banks thought they learned a lesson. And the lesson that they thought they learned was when we try and get too far down the creditworthiness spectrum, when we start lending to segments or doing banking services offering banking services to segments of the market that are lower than our high net worth customers. And when we get too creative, too innovative with our construction of funky assets like credit default swaps, then the world comes to an end and the regulators jump all over us. That's the story of 2008. At the same time, on the West Coast in 2008, you have an entire mindset from the likes of Google and Facebook. Right at 2008, this idea of ubiquity first, revenue later is taking off. So you have these two competing ideas. Innovation meant constructing really complicated assets around user design and user experience. And so innovation became a dirty word in banking in 2008 and 2009 after the financial crisis, as did this idea of serving the masses. But it took the technology companies to show the banks how.
It's interesting. I want to get back on that note to your Venmo story, because I think that leads us right back to these two guys talking about how the idea of writing a check seems outdated. But as you wrote, this company was, although it was ahead of its time, they had a great solution, Daniel. They got discovered at the right time because, as you wrote, they were about to go bankrupt, and this idea would have never gone anywhere had it not been picked up by the gentleman at Braintree.
Bill Reddy, who became the COO at PayPal when PayPal bought Braintree. And I think you see this a lot, first innovators, these discoverers of ideas, and then often people who have to come and make it a reality. That makes sense. So it isn't that sometimes they're the same person, but quite often the person who kind of invents the idea ultimately either needs a co-founder who has a very different skill set, or the backing of a large bank or financial institution or platform like Braintree and PayPal to kind of, that was certainly the case for Venmo. They had 2,000 customers and even fewer dollars in the bank.
That was so amazing when I read that. And I think about what Venmo is today, completely different thing.
Even in Venmo, there's an interesting, I don't know whether you've ever used Zelle.
Well, and I was just about to ask you about Zelle. Tell me that story.
People tend to give the banks a very hard time, and it's understandable, right? The banks are actually relatively smart. They wait on the sidelines. They see what works. And when they do, they featureize it inside their own platform. So this idea of featureization, where an entire subset of an entire company or an entire industry can become featureized inside a larger company. It's just turning delivery into a feature of inside the Amazon Borg. And a similar example exists if you guys are following Snapchat and Facebook and Facebook Instagram. Snapchat was the first to come out with stories, the first to come out with stories that disappear, the first to come out with filters. Doesn't mean they're winning. Why? Because everything that they've done, Instagram has said, yeah, that looks good. We'll do that too. Right. Snapchat can't innovate fast enough to escape the gravitational pull of the black hole that is the mass of Facebook and Instagram. Banks are doing the same thing with everything that the fintechs have created. Free trading, like Robinhood. Yep, that sounds good. We'll do that. Now, it's not without its disruption. Those are disruptive things, right? Schwab went to zero. That means TD had to sell themselves to Schwab. That means e-traders had to sell themselves to Morgan Stanley. But Robinhood, the guy that brought you the idea in the first place, ends up being the ultimate casualty, because the big guys have the gravitational pull. They have the resources. They have the customers. They have the scale. They have the infrastructure to say, yep, thank you for testing this for us. It would have been a costly exercise for us to see whether this worked. You've now proven that it's worked. And particularly over the last week where Robinhood has been sort of crapping out because
they have
performance issues, that will expedite their inevitable demise. I'm not here to pontificate on who's going to win and who's going to lose. But what I do think is that it's about the ideas. They've seeded these ideas, and these ideas aren't going anywhere. Zelle exists. We can now do what we should have ideally been able to do 10 years ago. Robo-advising exists. It's not going to go anywhere. I can't tell you what will happen to Betterment. That's going to go down to a very low price point. Free trading. That idea is here to stay. So the people that bring you the ideas inevitably fail to disrupt. And I've said this a lot. I think everybody expects a story of disruption to be like Netflix and Blockbuster. Everyone loves a David Goliath story, right? Everybody wants every one of these to be, JP Morgan is Kodak and, Betterment digital camera. But unfortunately, for every one of those stories, they build a better mousetrap and they fail because they haven't got the scale. They can't get the critical mass. And it's an easy enough idea. It doesn't have a patent or a competitive moat around it. In doing so, the incumbents become fundamentally changed.
There's another storyline here that I'd like to broach just before we say goodbye, which is in the second chapter, you talk about Prosper versus Lending Club. And the story kind of reminds me, Daniel, of the Art of War, and the best battle's the one that's never fought, because in that battle, the founder of Lending Club sees that the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to become a problem. And I wonder, for how many of these companies that you talk about is intervention by government entities an issue?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, especially in the United States. It's funny, Renaud Laplanche is the name of that guy, and he's emailing me as we talk. I've actually stayed close and become very good friends. What a fascinating guy. Totally wasn't, like so many of the people in this book, totally wasn't out of finance. Literally, technologist. One day he just gets a credit card statement, and he's like, I lend this to you at 2% and you give it back to me. This unfairness of the disparity between what you borrowed money from me at and what you lent it to me at was offensive. And it was that sense of umbrage that caused him to create Lending Club.
But I also love the fact, too, that he saw that he needed help, and even going to Facebook and saying, hey, how can I partner with these other people? I thought was brilliant, but obviously most brilliant, back to what you're addressing, was
the regulatory thing is important. I want to make sure we dwell on. It's a very tough regulatory environment in this country. If you want to start a bank, there are no less than 70 regulators that potentially you have to work with when you factor in the 50 individual state regulators. Some would argue that regulatory complexity goes beyond the necessary amount of security and actually throttles innovation and plays very much into the hands of the incumbents and makes it very, very difficult for fintechs to succeed. And this is true. If you look at the European neobanks that are trying to make their way over here right now, N26, Monzo, and Revolut, they're all partnering with existing banks. They can't do it on their own. And I think there is a larger thing here. So the storyline on Renault is he's up against Prosper. He has to make a decision about whether to work with regulators or not. He would have been well within his right to say, there isn't an existing set of regulation for this, I'm just going to go ahead. Instead, he puts it on pause, works with the regulators, and it turns out to be the right decision because shortly after that, the regulators put Prosper on pause, set that company back a year, and it was his decision to engage rather than take this kind of David and Goliath, as I say, this outsider posture that enabled him. He played the inside game. Yeah, the same thing with something like Ken Lin from Credit Karma, who, had to persuade the existing credit bureaus to let him work with them. I think the larger takeaway for anyone looking to disrupt any industry, you can push against an industry, but don't expect it not to push back. And if you're going to take on incumbents and you're going to openly say that you're going to disrupt the status quo, there's going to be a huge number of entrenched interests stacked against you. A guy called Charlie Shrem, he was the CEO of the first Bitcoin exchange called BitInstant. He went to jail for his involvement in the Silk Road, but he contends that it was the money transfer authorities, the money transfer license holders, I should say, people like Western Union and MoneyGram, who really conspired with the regulators to shut down his Bitcoin exchange.
Put him away, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, and I don't know if it's that I love fintech or I love seeing these big institutions meet innovators. And like you said, it's not David versus Goliath. It doesn't always end happily, but man, it's been a page turner. The book is called The Money Hackers. And I'm assuming, Daniel, we can get it everywhere, correct?
You absolutely can. The quickest and easiest place to get it is Amazon. If you just search Amazon for The Money Hackers, you can order it today.
Well, and I need to ask you another question, which is you always have so much going on as I have been following your career. I have to ask, you talked about, you put this book to bed a few months ago. Now you're talking about it with people like me. What's next for you? Where is your lens going to shine next?
Well, in the very short term, I'm going to be sharpening sticks in my bunker in New Jersey.
Right. As all of us, right?
But assuming I don't end up as a sort of Mad Max warlord controlling the water supply, my next area, I think, for a book in particular, the thing that I've always been fascinated about is small business. I'm a small business owner myself. I'm an entrepreneur. We actually have a small business crisis going on in this country right now. Small business formation, which is, by the way, the engine of so much of our national growth and our employment, is at pretty much all-time lows.
Right.
I kind of want to get to the bottom of why, and I want to try and encourage people to make that leap and reignite that entrepreneurial spark in people.
I can't wait to read about that, but I also can't wait because I'm only halfway through The Money Hackers to finish this one.
Yeah, you got to finish this.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's some other good stories in there for you to read.
I can't wait. And by the way, for anybody who is on their commute or walking the dog, we've got you covered. We'll have a link to The Money Hackers on our show notes page at stackingbenjamins.com. Daniel, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much for telling us stories about The Money Hackers.
Joe, thanks so much for having me.